Star Wars Episode 7 seemed to take a lot of people by surprise when it was announced. Cinematically, the franchise was said to have been done, but we certainly can't say it didn't go out not on a high note. I mean, you can say that. I'm not saying that. I would never say something like that. But here's the thing. Plans for Star Wars Episode 7 have been in place much longer than you may think. And that's what we're going to get into today. George Lucas has maintained for years that there wasn't really ever going to be an Episode 7. He stressed that the focus of Star Wars has always been on the character of Anakin Skywalker and watching his growth from a bowl-cut sporting pod racer, his phase of misplaced anger and indigenous slaughter, being kind of a good bloke for 5 minutes, then back to murder, followed by a horrific full-body barbecue and limb loss, getting a nice new suit, choking a guy, killing a guy, choking a guy with his mind, recruitment, a brief moment of goodwill, and then a much-deserved death. What a wild ride. He won't be missed. At the conclusion of the prequel trilogy in 2005, George Lucas had this to say about any additional Star Wars movies being made.
There is no Episode 7.
Even for someone else to come up with.
Well, there's possibility there may be another offshoot movie somewhere about an offshoot character in that world.
But not Episode 7.
But not about Luke Skywalker, not about that group of people and that struggle to bring democracy back to the galaxy.
Now look, it seems to me like this was something he very much believed at the time. It's apparent that he's a bit burnt out and soured on commercial filmmaking after the flack he received for his new trilogy. And that's something I think he understandably carries with him to this day.
You go to make a movie and all you do is get criticized and people try to make decisions about what you're going to do before you do it. You know, it's not much fun and you can't experiment. You can't do anything. You have to do it a certain way.
But here's the thing. There always seemed to have been a version of Episode 7 in the works, dating back over 3 decades. There exist interviews from that era where Lucas details information on 3 Star Wars trilogies. His original, a prequel trilogy set 20 years before, which obviously we saw, and a sequel trilogy set 20 years after. You know how I know this? I mean, you can just Google it. The Wikipedia page is, a pretty good place to start. But so is purchasing an original copy of Preview magazine dated September of 1980. Okay, so a large chunk of this publication does cover the 1980 film Xanadu starring Olivia Newton-John, but there's a pull-out section that includes an extensive interview with George Lucas based around the making of Empire Strikes Back and the future of the Star Wars franchise. It includes a number of interesting tidbits about how he was initially planning on making spin-off films that might focus only on Wookiees or droids, and maybe that's why we ended up with the Ewok films and the Droids animated series. Who knows? But of the sequels, he says, I'm gonna keep it pure. It's a 9-part saga that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It progresses over a period of 50 or 60 years, with about 20 years in between trilogies, each trilogy taking about 6 or 7 years. He goes on to say that he has titles for all 9 films. Now, I think the names of these were always in flux. I mean, at the very last minute, Revenge of the Jedi was changed to Return of the Jedi, but there was clearly enough story that he could tentatively name them. When pressed about what existing characters would return, he said that we'd see some recasted characters that were familiar in the prequels, but would only confirm C-3PO and R2-D2 as showing up in every film. Also, he makes mention that Steven Spielberg was very interested in making Episode 7 6 or so years from then, placing it around 1986. And this may explain why he very nearly directed Return of the Jedi. Now, by the time Return of the Jedi rolled around in 1983, it was obvious that Lucas was tired of Star Wars films. He was quoted as saying, "I'm only doing this because I started it, and now I have to finish it. And the next trilogy will be someone else's vision." The pressures of filmmaking, though, were obviously taking its toll. Not to mention he was finalizing a divorce, and I think his concern relating to filmmaking was just to wrap this franchise up and put it aside. Because Return of the Jedi was not the film we were initially going to get. Producer Gary Kurtz has spoken of a much darker ending, which I'm not going to get into here, but it includes a story point that Luke and Leia were initially not to be brother and sister. Lucas himself has never confirmed this, but their relationship leading up to this revelation certainly indicated that they weren't connected in that way. Gross. Stop it! See, no one ever mentions the second kiss, but it's still weird. So what was initially to happen in Episode 7? Kurtz in 1999 spoke at a science fiction expo about the original plans for all 9 films, and details that Episode 7 was to focus on Luke's life as a Jedi, with very few details planned out. In Episode 8, Luke's sister would then appear from another part of the galaxy, and the Emperor would finally be unveiled in Episode 9. Specifics about what else was to happen have not been specific, and much of it is speculation, but Mark Hamill was clearly let in on some plot points all the way back whilst filming the first Star Wars, as highlighted in this clip from the 80s. Did I need to say it was the 80s? I mean, come on, what's going on? What is that cardigan?
He at one time said, would you consider playing an Obi-Wan type character handing Excalibur down to the next generation? I said, when would that be? And at the time he said around 2011. I thought, gee, as much as I'd like to have a job lined up at the turn of the century, I was figuring out how old I'd be at that point, and I thought, well, I don't know.
Okay, so Luke Skywalker was to become the Obi-Wan Kenobi mentor figure, which is, sort of what we got. I mean, we don't really know what kind of character he is yet. He just did a bit of forlorn staring, but it almost certainly seems to be heading that way, just a few years later than Lucas originally intended. The other thing that can be taken into account is George Lucas's story treatments that he handed over to Disney when he sold them Lucasfilm. These treatments he could have very well written at any time, but yes, he obviously had a clear idea of where he wanted the characters to go.
I have story treatments of 7, 8, and 9 and a bunch of other movies, and I sort of moved that treasure trove of stories and various things to Kathy, and I have complete confidence that she's going to take them and make great movies.
So what happened to these ideas? Well, to put it delicately, before J.J. Abrams came on board, newly appointed Lucasfilm head Kathleen Kennedy and the Disney higher-ups decided that they should consider other options. Because Lucas's treatment was again to center around very young characters, teenagers, and it was speculated that they didn't want anything in the new movies to be compared to the 9-year-old Anakin Skywalker and 14-year-old Queen Amidala from The Phantom Menace.
I'm a person and my name is Anakin.
The departures, Kennedy said, happened exactly in the way that any project in development would. But concepts from the book The Art of Star Wars: The Force Awakens may offer some additional clues to what Lucas intended. You see, one of the processes of filmmaking, in particular big budget, high concept projects like Star Wars, is that conceptual artists are given both free rein and also very rough ideas in terms of what direction the film is to take to begin to craft the world, as this in turn helps develop the story. George Lucas did meet with the team, and it's possible that the art of characters called Kira, an early version of Rey, who's described as a loner, hothead, gearhead, badass, and Sam, who is pure charisma, were those young characters that Lucas wanted to make the focus of the films. Other ideas that could be potentially attributed to him is the return of young Anakin Skywalker in ghost form, Jedi hunters, the inclusion of Vader's castle, and Kira finding a map to the location of Luke Skywalker and the Jedi in the Emperor's Tower from the second Death Star, which is now submerged in water. But really, all that is just pure speculation on my behalf. Lucas actually began developing his ideas with the intention to begin making these films before he sold the company to Disney. He would himself direct episode 7 and then leave 8 and 9 up to somebody else. But Disney were like, no thank you, we'll just, why don't we do it? Why don't we do all of them? The only thing that he's publicly mentioned about his version is that Star Wars has always been a family story, and he simply planned on continuing that story.
They looked at the stories and they said, we want to make something for the fans. So I said, all I wanted to do was tell a story of what happened. It started here and it went there. And it's all about generations, and it's about, the issues of fathers and sons and grandfathers, and it's a family soap opera.
He was of course disappointed that Disney threw out his pitch and didn't like the idea that instead of moving forward, the films, or at very least the first one, would act as a retread of the originals.
They wanted to do a retro movie. I don't like that. Every movie I worked very hard to make them different.
On a side note, I'll say this of Lucas. He didn't have to hand them over. And frankly, why should he have? People have been dicks to him about the prequels. And I'm certainly not exempt from that.
George Lucas raped our childhood. George Lucas raped our childhood. George Lucas raped our childhood.
But at the end of the day, I've come to respect that he got to make the movies that he wanted and continue to push what was possible in terms of modern filmmaking. He's been savvy enough to forge his own path in Hollywood, and that's really commendable. And I believe that a lot of his actions have been to benefit others. This was evident as far back as 1983, where he left filmmaking essentially to be a good dad. He's donated hundreds of millions of dollars to a number of programs including Make-A-Wish, Film Foundation, and Stand Up to Cancer, and plans to use the bulk of his $4 billion received from his sale to Disney to improve education. Also, a massive part of selling Lucasfilm was to ensure that the 2,000 or so employees kept their jobs by ensuring that they had future projects to work on. I guess what I'm saying is, you can't really get mad at the endless stream of merchandising when what it boils down to, I believe, is a man who not only wants to make films, but also make a difference. But here's my question to you. Would you have liked to have seen a George Lucas version of Episode 7? And what do you think that film might have been like? I know not everybody was happy with The Force Awakens retreading so much ground, so if you got something to say, feel free to leave a comment, or any comment. You might be interested in a video on the original Star Wars sequel that was to happen if the first film was a flop, told in motion comic format. That's linked right there, and also below, along with my podcast, The Weekly Planet, the world's best podcast, as voted by your mum. Ha! Nah, she's alright. Okay, thanks for watching, everyone. Take care.